This paper I'm going to read is about Plato's dialogue on what is holiness or piety or righteousness. What does it mean to be a God-loving, God-fearing person? Rational and Irrational Piety, Response to Martha Nussbaum and Arlene Saxonhouse. In her book, The Fragility of Goodness, Luck and Ethics in Greek Tragedy and Philosophy, Martha Nussbaum claims that Greek tragedies are filled with situations involving tragic conflict. In such cases, Nussbaum writes, we see a wrong action committed without any direct physical compulsion and in full knowledge of its nature by a person whose ethical character or commitments would otherwise dispose him to reject the act. The constraints come from the presence of circumstances that prevent the adequate fulfillment of two valid ethical claims. Tragedy tends, on the whole, to take such situations very seriously. It treats them as real cases of wrongdoing that are of relevance for an assessment of the agent's ethical life. Unquote. Nussbaum believes one major motive behind Plato's dialogues is to establish an ethical system which will eliminate the possibility of tragic conflict in life. For Nussbaum, the Euthyphro dialogue is one case where the major character, Euthyphro, is caught in a tragic conflict. Euthyphro's father had a slave who killed another slave while drunk. Euthyphro's father had the slave bound and thrown into a ditch, while a messenger was sent to Delphi to ask the oracle what to do with him. During the messenger's absence, the slave died. Euthyphro's dilemma concerns whether or not he should prosecute his father for murder. Nussbaum describes Euthyphro's choices in this way, quote, it is not clear, in fact, that there would be general agreement that Euthyphro has an obligation to prosecute his father because of the servant's death. But the situation does seem to call for a prosecution. One of the serious gaps in Greek homicide law is that no specific provision is made for a case in which the deceased is a foreigner and therefore has no relations present to assume the duty. Euthyphro could appropriately feel that if someone ought to prosecute, the obligation fell naturally to him as the citizen most closely associated with the interests of the deceased. Unquote. Nussbaum believes that Plato intends to replace a view of life in which irresolvable tragic conflicts occur with a view of life in which conflicts can always be resolved through the use of reason. This I disagree with, obviously. Plato is implicitly criticizing the tragedians, claims Nussbaum, because Plato believes the power of reason can overcome tragedy in life. She says, quote, for this attitude, taking tragic conflict seriously, Greek tragedy has been repeatedly assailed as morally primitive. The attack begins with the beginning of moral philosophy. Socrates tells Euthyphro, himself enmeshed, we might think, in just such a dilemma, that stories depicting the collisions of competing claims of right are repugnant to reason, since they assert a contradiction. By this argument, my dear Euthyphro, the pious and the impious would be one and the same. Unquote. That's quoting Socrates. Such illogical stories cannot provide suitable models for our exploration of what piety is. Unquote. Nussbaum believes the Euthyphro represents a watershed in the history of moral philosophy. From now on, the belief in the power of reason to override any possible moral conflict will lead to the denial of tragedy as part of the human condition. Quote, from the time of the Euthyphro onward, a dominant tradition in moral philosophy has agreed on one central point. These cases of conflict display an inconsistency which is an offense to practical logic and ought to be eliminated. Socrates already makes the crucial move. The conflicting claims in Euthyphro's dilemma, his obligation to respect his father and his obligation to defend human life, are construed as a case of ethical disagreement, a conflict of ethical beliefs about what is and is not appropriate. But if two beliefs conflict, it is only rational to try to find out which is the correct one. At most, one can be true. Unquote. Since the Olympian gods make conflicting demands on human beings, Socrates' replacement of traditional Greek religion with a desire for rational consistency implicitly undermines traditional Greek theology. Quote, this position leads Socrates later in the dialogues to question a central element in traditional Greek theology, the idea that the gods impose upon mortals divergent and even conflicting requirements. Unquote. In a sense, then, Mellitus' charge against Socrates that he does not believe in the gods the city believes in is true. Quote, Socrates is in effect conducting an assault upon the old gods in the name of reason, even as he goes to answer the charges against him. Unquote. Nussbaum is not critical of Socrates and or Plato because he does not believe in a literal interpretation of Homer. Rather, she criticizes Plato for trying to eliminate tragedy from human life. The Euthyphro, for Nussbaum, is the first step in a long historical philosophical tradition in the West of trying to educate young people to become rationally detached. Arlene Saxonhouse, by contrast, has a very different interpretation of the Euthyphro. She accuses Euthyphro, not Socrates, of being overly rational and of seeking universal standards of right and wrong rather than recognizing the uniqueness of each particular situation. She begins with a vivid description of the physical setting of the dialogue because the setting is connected to the issues involved. Quote, it was the function of the Archon Basileus, the magistrate located at the Stoa Basileus, to deal with legal cases having to do with religion, including homicide cases, by assigning them to one of the particular courts charged with handling cases of impiety or of homicide. It was here that the laws of the city stood inscribed on the stone tablets, the stelae, for all to see in their physical manifestation. Any law not so inscribed lost its force. The validity of laws depended on their physical presence at the Stoa Basileus. Thus, as Euthyphro and Socrates discuss the meaning of piety, they are surrounded by the laws of the city, laws that are physically present and visible on the stele all around them. Saxonhouse argues that the legal tradition, with its emphasis on treating every citizen equally, is one manifestation of an old Athenian myth. Quote, the tradition myths of autochthony are the basis of the Athenian self-conception of their own origins. These are men sprung from the earth, with neither father nor mother, but, as citizens, related to one another by a common parentage in the earth itself. Unquote. According to Saxonhouse, it is Euthyphro, not Socrates, who views the world from the point of view of a social order structured by laws which are known by human reason and applied in ways which detach people from their identities as unique individuals. Euthyphro is focused on the universal and rational rather than on the particular emotional and physical human beings. Quote, in such an autochthonous world, Euthyphro's prosecution of the murderer would be pious. The complexity imposed by a world in which he does have a father raises questions about the piety of his deeds. Saxonhouse accuses Euthyphro of being excessively rationalistic in his understanding of human life. Quote, Euthyphro desires a concept of righteousness that is absolute and can remove him from the complexity of family ties. Euthyphro wants universal prescriptions without complexity. For this he turns to the abstract institution of the city, to the public realm, for the case that traditionally was handled as a private crime. The purification Euthyphro seeks is to come from the laws of the city, not from the religion of the family. Unquote. Unlike Nussbaum, Saxonhouse argues that it is Socrates who tries to make Euthyphro less rationalistic. Socrates wants Euthyphro to consider the case from the point of view of the particular individuals involved. Quote, Socrates' task here, I believe, is to force Euthyphro to understand complexity, to raise questions about attempts to impose abstract definitions and principles ideas of right and wrong, just and unjust, pious and impious in a complex world, unquote. Saxonhouse thinks Socrates treats the Athenians as a father who would treat his children, rather than the way the laws treat human beings. Throughout Plato's dialogues, quote, Socrates must show how his life, unique in the experience of Athens, accomplished what the institutions of the city cannot, a binding together of family and city that Mellitus cannot comprehend. Socrates paints himself almost as a father to the members of the city. He blurs the distinction between public and private life, for, in becoming like a father to the citizens of Athens, he transforms the city into his family, and indeed his family into his city. His relationship to the citizens is not impartial interactions, but personal care, unquote. Socrates' way of engaging the Athenians in general, and Euthyphro in particular, is different from the way the Athenians, as citizens in a democracy, are treated by the laws, according to Saxonhouse. Quote, Socrates' concern with the particular thus sets him at odds with the development in Athens of the democratic polity that, with its focus on equality before the laws, aimed at a citizenry of equals bound to the city by their uniformity rather than their individuality. To achieve the unity of the city, the traditional bonds to the family needed to be fractured and the individual released from those ties. In the democratic reforms of Athens, we see a new picture of the individual removed from his past. A third alternative. At first glance, these two interpretations seem to be mutually exclusive. There's evidence to support each case. The issues involved are extremely important, even fundamental to understanding the philosophical enterprise. What exactly is the nature of philosophical inquiry? Is Socratic dialectic focused exclusively on particulars, on Socrates and his interlocutors? Or is the philosophical enterprise so fixated on universals and on internal consistency that the existential realities of conflicting duties and emotions are not even recognized, much less taken seriously as a meaningful part of life? Is philosophy a serious threat to the traditional beliefs of any city, or does philosophy bind family and city together? Is the philosopher a heartless judge, or a loving, caring father? How can these positions be reconciled? How can we make sense of such different characterizations of philosophy? Most importantly, for the purposes of this paper, what does the Euthyphro tell its reader about the philosophical enterprise as Socrates engaged in it? The goal of this paper will be to resolve this conflict by, in some sense, transcending it. The philosophical enterprise will be defined in a way which makes it more detached than Saxonhouse presents, and more humane than Nussbaum claims. The main issue here is the nature and object of reason. What are the activities and goals of reason? Nussbaum claims that the functions of reason in Plato are to use practical logic to resolve all cases of conflict or inconsistency in ethical theory and practice, and in that process to eliminate fragility. For Saxonhouse, the purpose of Euthyphro's notion of reason is to formulate a body of laws which all human beings must obey equally, apart from age, race, sex, class, or any other particular circumstances. Socratic dialectic, by contrast, is an activity which engages the whole person. This paper will be based on a different notion of the object of reason and the activity of reasoning. Instead of a body of universal laws, or the construction of a consistent ethical system, the objects of reason are patterns in the way human beings think, feel, and act, or what I will call patterns of the human soul. Plato recognized continually reoccurring patterns in the way people live their lives, as did the tragedians and Homer, incidentally. His dialogues are intended to express those patterns so that his readers can recognize those same patterns in their own lives and the lives of those they know. On this model, every individual lives out a certain pattern or way of life which engages all aspects and particularities of his or her life. It is possible to recognize the same patterns even in a very different particular historical context. This model for the nature of the object of reason or mind is explicitly described as a pattern or paradigm in the Republic. Since the Republic is about justice, one of the purposes of that dialogue was to present the paradigms of both the just and the unjust human being. Quote, "A pattern, then," said Socrates, "was what we wanted when we were inquiring into the nature of ideal justice and asking what would be the character of the perfectly just person, supposing him to exist, and likewise in regard to injustice and the completely unjust person. We wished to fix our eyes upon them as types and models, so that whatever we discerned in them of happiness or the reverse would necessarily apply to ourselves." Unquote. Since the Euthyphro is a dialogue on piety, it seems reasonable to suppose that the two principal characters, Euthyphro and Socrates, represent patterns of piety and impiety respectively. Piety is not primarily a property of actions or of laws, but part of a way of living. The particular thoughts and actions of Euthyphro are both unique to him as well as interrelated in a way which indicates a character type manifested in many people. In this paper, Mellitus' accusation against Socrates will also be used as another example of the same character type. The particular thoughts and actions of Socrates are not unique to Socrates, even though Socrates was considered to be an utterly unique human being. Rather, piety as he manifested it should be one aspect of any well-lived, examined life. This paper will focus on the first one-third of the dialogue because it is here that the two basic patterns of soul are set out for the reader. The rest of the dialogue follows from the original distinctions between pious and impious human beings. Or, to follow what I've been saying, there's the cave view of piety and the light view of piety. There's philosophical piety and unphilosophical piety. Mellitus and Euthyphro, a pattern of impious living. The text opens with a unique and very significant situation. Euthyphro and Socrates meet on the steps of the Archon king's court. Euthyphro is there because he's prosecuting his father for murder. Socrates is there because Mellitus is prosecuting him for corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods the city believes in. A close examination of the two cases reveals a great deal about the characters and all the issues involved in a complete discussion of the nature of piety. The dialogue takes place in 399 BC. The reign of the 30 tyrants 5 years before is fresh in every Athenian's mind. Although the regime came to power in the name of a return to tradition, including traditional religious beliefs and practices, the rule of the 30 proved to be a reign of terror. After 9 months, the regime was overpowered and replaced by a democratic form of government. By 399 BC, a democratic regime was in place, but it was weak. Because of its weaknesses, innovations in religious belief were looked upon as threats, and yet the Athenians also recognized the extremes to which religious intolerance can go and the way individuals can accuse others of impiety to further their own political ambitions. The new democratic order needed stability and yet did not want to revert to reactionary and coercive tactics. There's evidence in the dialogue itself that the Athenians are confused and cannot tell the difference between a false prophet and a true prophet, or between innovations in religious belief and practice, which are well-intentioned and beneficial to the society, and innovations in religion which are motivated by personal ambition and are harmful to social order. Within this context, the indictments brought by Mellitus and Euthyphro present a myriad of ironic and complex juxtapositions of youth and old age, stability and change, humility and arrogance. Both Mellitus and Euthyphro are younger men accusing their elders of some kind of wickedness. Both have chosen to make public reputations for themselves by bringing their accusations into a court of law and making criminal charges. Both situations are extremely ironic for the same reasons. At one level, the accusers seem to be and claim to be very pious and very concerned to preserve belief in the traditional gods, as described by Homer and Hesiod. On the other hand, their indictments seem to be impious because they demonstrate an extreme disrespect for their elders, one important aspect of traditional notions of piety. The very fact that both men are able and willing to make criminal accusations against their elders indicates that many traditional customs and values no longer have a hold on the Athenians. Euthyphro's and Mellitus' notions of how a pious person should behave are very different from the views of their elders. The text indicates that both Euthyphro and Mellitus are engaged in the replacement of the old social order by a new democratic order in the name of a return to traditional religious beliefs. Ironically, Socrates' view of Euthyphro's case indicates Socrates' adherence to traditional notions of respect for elders, even as he is being accused by Mellitus of impiety. Oh my gosh, and Plato thinks you're going to get rid of tragedy and irony. Okay. In Socrates' description of Mellitus, Mellitus is said to be young, unknown, and from the deme of Pythos. Socrates does not say who Mellitus' father was, indicating that he was not from one of the privileged aristocratic families in Athens. Pythos was a political boundary created during the democratic reforms of Cleanthes. Mellitus' public identity, then, comes from the democratic regime, not from the older aristocratic one. The fact that Mellitus is able and willing to bring his case to court indicates the following. First, that the old order, including old political boundaries and old established families, is being replaced by unknown individuals who live in areas defined by the democratic regime. And second, this new generation of democratic individuals does not believe in respect for parents or elders, if such respect might require a less rigid application of democratic laws. A further indication of the collapse of the old social order is the fact that this case is what was called a graphe. Quote, graphe are brought by those who claim to care to preserve the institutions themselves against those who threaten them, unquote. The irony here is that in the very act of charging Socrates with making religious innovations and creating new gods, Mellitus is acting in ways which are making innovations in the social order. He's overthrowing traditional notions of who's qualified to protect the legitimacy of religious beliefs and religious institutions, particularly before a court of law. Euthyphro's own description of his court case indicates that in the name of preserving piety and justice, Euthyphro is also violating traditional notions of what is pious and just. He's replacing a social order based on hierarchy and fidelity to family with a social order based on equality. When he first explains the case to Socrates, and Socrates expresses surprise, Euthyphro says, quote, "You amuse me, Socrates. You think it makes a difference whether the victim was a member of the family or not related, when the only thing to watch is whether it was right or not for the man who did the deed to kill him? If it was justified, then let him go. If not, you have to prosecute him, no matter if the man who killed him shares your hearth and sits at table with you," unquote. Euthyphro's case is classified as a dike as opposed to a graphe. Where Mellitus acted on behalf of the citizens and the youth and accused Socrates of threatening the social order, Euthyphro is taking an event which happened on a family farm, which could have been resolved within the family, and is making a public accusation against his father. Quote, A decay must be brought by those affected by the crime, those who use the institutions of the city to resolve private conflicts." Unquote. Euthyphro could have kept the issue within the confines of his family. This is what the elders believed to be the pious decision. Quote, Euthyphro says, "They say that for a son to prosecute his father as a murderer is unholy." Unquote. He chose to bring the case to court because he wanted to make a public statement that the new democratic order is more important than family ties. Although the cases appear different from the point of view of the legal system then, the underlying motives of Euthyphro and Mellitus are surprisingly similar. Also in common with Mellitus, Euthyphro is disguising the way he's undermining the social order by claiming to act on behalf of a return to traditional religious texts, meaning an unquestioning belief in the truth of what is said in Homer in Hesiod about the gods. Mellitus accuses Socrates of not believing in the city's gods, because Socrates does not accept such a view of either the gods or of piety. Euthyphro, on the other hand, justifies his behavior toward his father by referring to the stories of Homer. Quote, "Does not mankind believe that Zeus is the most excellent and just among the gods? And these same men admit that Zeus shackled his own father, Cronos, for swallowing his other sons unjustly, and that Cronos in turn had gelded his father Uranos for like reasons. But now they are enraged at me when I proceed against my father for wrongdoing, and so they contradict themselves in what they say about the gods and what they say about me." Unquote. This particular kind of literalism, however, was a departure from traditional notions of piety. The average Athenian did not think that human behavior should be identical to the behavior of the gods. Athenians were taught that traditional piety includes respect for one's parents. The stories of Cronos and Uranos and of Zeus and Cronos simply show that the gods act differently from men and demand that human beings behave differently than they do. To try and imitate the gods and to act in ways which they are described as acting, but which violate respect for one's parents, is impious behavior. For man to imitate the gods is a violation of the cosmic order. It is hubris or pride. Euthyphro's behavior, then, according to the traditionalists, is extremely impious. And I'll add that, of course, the stories are symbolic and they're trying to educate the dark shadow and assimilate and all that other stuff. But on a literal view, Euthyphro is being impious. Further, in both Mellitus and Euthyphro's cases, religious intolerance is the sine qua non of publicly proving one's piety. Both men are self-righteous rather than truly righteous. When asked to define holiness, Euthyphro's first comment is not a definition, but a description of his own action. Quote, "The holy is what I am now doing, prosecuting the wrongdoer who commits a murder or a sacrilege, robbery, or sins in any point like that, whether it be your mother, your father, or whoever it may be." Unquote. Both Euthyphro and Mellitus assume they know who the wrongdoers are, what they did wrong, and that the duty of a truly pious person is to judge others. There are reasons to suspect each man's purity of heart, his personal piety. There are also political reasons to be suspicious of Mellitus and Euthyphro's piety. Both Mellitus and Euthyphro have a personal interest in promoting the new democratic order. Mellitus and Euthyphro's public indictments have moved them from being socially marginalized to being at the very heart of the Athenian political arena, the Stoa Basileus. In the old order, Mellitus was an unknown, and Euthyphro a country hick who gets laughed at in the assembly. In the new order, the opinions of such men, opinions about the most serious questions in life, about good and evil, piety and impiety, justice and injustice, are considered just as valuable and true as the opinions of the established aristocratic elite. Further, their ability to turn their opinions into public policy does not depend on proving the legitimacy of their positions, but rather depends on their ability to persuade a jury of peers in a democratic court. Both Mellitus and Euthyphro seem ready, able, and willing to use the legal system to win their cases and along with that improve their social standing. When Socrates tells Euthyphro that Mellitus has accused him, Euthyphro assumes that Mellitus' goal is simply to manipulate the jury for personal gain. Euthyphro does not even consider the possibility that Mellitus might be right. In fact, thinks Socrates is impious and a corrupting influence on the youth. Rather, Euthyphro assumes Mellitus acts for his own personal gain. Quote, he charges you in this indictment with introducing novelties in religion, and that's the reason why he comes to court with this slanderous complaint, well knowing how easily such matters can be misrepresented to the crowd. Unquote. Euthyphro knows the average Athenian can be manipulated. Further, Euthyphro is very confident that he will win his case in court. When Socrates asks him about whether he anticipates being able to prove his case in court, Euthyphro replies, I shall prove it absolutely, Socrates, if they will listen to me, unquote. In direct contrast with Socrates, who's not at all confident that he will successfully defend himself, Euthyphro says, quote, if he, Mellitus, undertook to bring me to court, I guess I would find out his rotten spot, and our talk there would concern him sooner by a long shot than ever it would me, unquote. It seems then that Mellitus and Euthyphro, two men who were not born into power and privilege, have recognized their opportunity to gain upward social mobility. They will seize their opportunity by publicly denouncing someone else, someone associated with the old order. They want to gain the approval of a jury of peers, of fellow citizens who themselves were not born into power and privilege, and who also have an interest in denouncing the older generation. By contrast, Socrates is completely out of place in a court of law, as Euthyphro recognizes. It is understandable, therefore, that given the opportunity for social mobility, both Mellitus and Euthyphro claim to know a great deal about good and evil. When referring to Mellitus' charge against him, Socrates says, quote, it is no mean charge. For a man of his age, it is no small thing to have settled a question of such importance. He says, in fact, that he knows the method by which young people are corrupted, and knows who the persons are that do it. When Socrates first finds out that Euthyphro is accusing his father of murder, Socrates indicates his surprise at how much Euthyphro thinks he knows about good and evil. Quote, I fancy it is not correct for any ordinary person to do, but only for a man already far advanced in point of wisdom. Unquote. Euthyphro indicates that he believes he knows more than the average person about such matters. Quote, yes, Socrates, by heaven, far advanced. In both cases, Mellitus and Euthyphro were willing to violate traditional norms of pious behavior as respect for elders and replace it with piety as interpreting Homer in ways which lead to obedience and respect for the new democratic order. Many Athenians do not like Socrates, but did not take him to court because it did not seem appropriate, especially since he was an old man. It was a young and unknown man, Mellitus, who made himself the moral judge of Socrates and took his case before a democratic court of law, where the laws are indifferent to age and experience. In Euthyphro's case, the text shows how radical Socrates thought Euthyphro's court case is. Quote, and the man your father killed, was he a relative of yours? Of course he was. You would never prosecute your father, would you, for the death of anybody who was not related to you? Unquote. Socrates' reaction indicates that Socrates' personal judgment followed the traditional notions of piety as respect for elders. Although he was accused of not believing in the city's gods, he still behaved in ways which followed traditional notions of piety as respect for elders. Euthyphro is more of a religious innovator than Socrates is. The holy person, then, according to Mellitus and Euthyphro, does not have to know himself or live an examined life, as Socrates would advocate. Rather, the test of his holiness is his ability to see into the hearts and souls of other people. Further, the holy person takes what he sees in those hearts and souls, and, if he thinks he sees corruption, announces to the public the corruption he sees. Further, a truly holy person brings those he believes to be corrupt into court and makes them suffer either imprisonment or death. The holy person then claims to know what a traditional would claim only the gods know, the hearts and souls of others. In addition, the holy person uses social institutions and political power to condemn and kill others on the basis of the divine insight he has. To the average Athenian, such knowledge seems superhuman, hence such behavior seems extremely impious. This is even more extreme in Mellitus and Euthyphro's cases, because the people being accused were not universally agreed upon to be incurably wicked. As a matter of fact, some people believed Euthyphro's father acted piously in the situation because he sent a messenger to the oracle to find out what to do, and many people believe Socrates was a truly pious man. Both Euthyphro's father and Socrates believed in the gods or divinities of some sort. Both deferred to the oracle at Delphi before they made a decision to act. Both men were guilty of neglect while attending to the oracle. Euthyphro's father's slave was neglected and died while the messenger was still gone. Socrates neglected his family and personal affairs because of what he considered his religious duty to care for the Athenians as a father cares for his children. Euthyphro's and Mellitus' understanding of the nature and degree of corruption or wickedness in others is far from self-evident or universally agreed upon. Their claims to know that Socrates was wicked enough to be killed and that Euthyphro's father was a murderer seem to be extremely arrogant and impious. Mellitus and Euthyphro have made themselves into gods by judging, condemning, and killing or imprisoning those they believe to be wicked. Furthermore, there's evidence that they are using these court cases to improve their social status. In short, these men represent impiety as a quality of the human soul. Given the many similarities between Euthyphro and Mellitus and their lack of piety, the most surprising and perhaps most wrenching aspect of this part of the dialogue is that Euthyphro clearly identifies with Socrates. When Euthyphro first finds out about Mellitus' accusation, Euthyphro says, quote, "When he starts to injure you, it simply looks to me like beginning at the hearth to hurt the state," unquote. This is extremely ironic since, by the end of the dialogue, it's clear that Socrates thinks what Euthyphro is doing is beginning at the hearth to hurt the state. Socrates says, "If you did not know precisely what is holy and unholy, it is unthinkable that for a simple hireling you ever would have moved to prosecute your aged sire on a charge of murder," unquote. Euthyphro's reason for identifying with Socrates is that he thinks they are both innovators in religious matters. Socrates is an innovator because he has a daimon and because he thinks it is his divine mission to roam the streets of Athens asking people questions about their lives in ways which force them to re-examine who they are and what they know and do not know. Socrates tries to cure people of the belief that they know more than they really know. Euthyphro is an innovator because he interprets his religious duty to be bringing his father to court. In order to do so, Euthyphro has to interpret Homer as intending human beings to identify with and behave like the gods. Both in his interpretation of Homer and his application of Homer to the case of his father, Euthyphro thinks he knows more than he knows. He has the conceit of wisdom, not real wisdom. Socrates clearly does not identify with Euthyphro. Socrates makes many references which indicate that he and Euthyphro are different. The people laugh at Euthyphro, but they're angry at Socrates. Socrates distinguishes between Euthyphro's didactic way of speaking and his own method of dialectical inquiry. Quote, "The Athenians, as it seems to me, are not very much disturbed if he thinks that so-and-so is clever, so long as he does not impart his knowledge to anybody else," unquote. Again, Socrates points this out, quote, "Quite possibly you strike them as a man who is chary of himself and is unwilling to impart his wisdom. As for me, I fear that I am so kindly, they will think that I pour out all I have to everyone. Euthyphro's knowledge consists in prophesying the future. He says, I never have made a prediction that did not come true. And yet, soon after making that claim, Euthyphro makes a false prophecy. Quote, you will carry your case as you desire, Socrates, and I think that I shall carry mine. Unquote. On the other hand, when he's been condemned to death, Socrates accurately predicts that the reputation of the Athenians will suffer greatly for having killed him. Most importantly, Socrates and Euthyphro differ on how to interpret Homer and how to apply Homer to one's everyday life. The average Athenian traditionalist is outraged and offended by both men's religious innovations. In Euthyphro's case, Euthyphro uses the texts of Homer to justify his own actions. The Athenians are appalled because they believe the gods are allowed to engage in behavior which is impious for human beings. Socrates is also appalled with Euthyphro's justification for his behavior, but for entirely different reasons. Socrates simply rejects the truth of Homer's stories. Quote, there, Euthyphro, you have the reason why the charge is brought against me. It is because whenever people tell such stories about the gods, I am prone to take it ill. Unquote. Socrates is an innovator in religious matters because he does not believe the gods do wicked things. Socrates, on the other hand, rejects the truth of the stories because he believes the human mind is capable of understanding to some degree what is true, good, and holy, and no god would do anything that's clearly wicked and unholy. As Socrates in the Republic says, and in the Phaedrus, he indicates that he knows that the stories are symbolic and metaphorical and not intended to be literal. Socrates could be accused of impiety because he does not think piety consists in a literal reading of Homer. If Homer indeed portrays the gods as irrational and wicked, then either the texts are not meant to be read literally, or else they're false. Socrates assumes the gods are rational and virtuous. To believe otherwise is impious. This distinction runs throughout the rest of the dialogue. Since Euthyphro's motive is to imitate the gods, he must spend the rest of his life memorizing the holy books and what the gods want, so he can imitate and please the gods in ways which are beneficial to him. It's already clear at this point in the dialogue that Euthyphro's using his knowledge of Homer to gain a public reputation for himself. He's using the gods for his own purposes by claiming to honor and worship them. Since Socrates' motive is to seek truth, justice, and wisdom, he must spend his life questioning himself and others about such matters, so he will, in turn, understand better what the gods want from human beings. His dialogue with Euthyphro is part of his search for the truth about piety. Since Socrates believes the gods love something because it is pious, Socrates must spend his life finding out what piety is before he can ever understand the gods or what the gods love and want from human beings. The problem which emerges early in the dialogue is that the Athenians cannot recognize the difference between Euthyphro and Socrates. They're threatened by both of them. This is pointed to indirectly in the dialogue itself. When Socrates finds out the facts surrounding Euthyphro's indictment, it's clear that Socrates thinks Euthyphro thinks he knows more than he knows about holiness and unholiness. Instead of beginning his characteristic elenchus at this point, however, Socrates says he wants to become Euthyphro's pupil. Quote, well then, admirable Socrates, Euthyphro, the best thing I can do is to become your pupil and challenge Mellitus before the trial comes on. I could say, come, Mellitus, if you agree that Euthyphro has wisdom in such matters, you must admit as well that I hold the true belief and must not prosecute. If you do not, you must lodge your complaint not against me, but against my aforesaid master. Accuse him of corrupting the elder generation, me and his own father, me by his instruction, his father by correcting and chastising him. Socrates implies that the Athenians are confused and have accused Socrates of having the same kind of arrogance as Euthyphro has. Clearly, the Athenians are legitimately concerned about piety because they need the kind of piety which leads to family and social stability. Unfortunately, they're misguided in their understanding of which religious leaders and innovators are truly pious and which are not. Even more ironically, Mellitus and the other Athenians have not recognized Euthyphro as impious. Quote, "This Mellitus, I perceive, along presumably with everybody else, appears to overlook you, but sees into me so easily and keenly that he's attacked me for impiety." That's what Socrates says. Why would Mellitus overlook Euthyphro's particular brand of impiety? Perhaps because it is so much like his own. At the beginning of this paper, I claim that the Euthyphro dialogue presents two patterns of soul, one representing piety and the other impiety. Throughout the analysis of the text, a number of characteristics of Mellitus and Euthyphro were discussed and connected with impiety. Mellitus and Euthyphro were contrasted with Socrates, who therefore represents a pattern of piety. What are these patterns? The remainder of this paper will summarize the two patterns and address Nussbaum's and Sachsenhause's claim about the dialogue and the nature of reason. What then are piety and impiety? Piety concerns a belief in some sort of powers or realities greater than human beings. I'm claiming that an impious person claims to know more about these powers than it is humanly possible to know. An impious person claims to have the kind of knowledge that God alone can have. Such a person claims to know the will of the gods and the divine meanings behind human events. The impious person, therefore, also claims to have superhuman knowledge of other human beings. Further, the impious person uses his arrogant beliefs about the gods and men to publicly label other human beings as impious. He's arrogant enough to question another's reputation and to even take them into court of law and have them imprisoned or killed on the basis of claiming to know more about them and about the divine than it is humanly possible to know. He may make a public reputation for himself as pious by criticizing and condemning others. An impious person claims to be well versed in the religious beliefs and customs of his day and uses them to promote his own interests and reputations as divine. Mellitus and Euthyphro seem to fit the pattern. A pious person, on my view, naturally, is the opposite of this. A pious person believes in divine powers greater than humankind and takes time to participate in the rituals and reflections which deepen his or her commitment to this belief and to incorporating these religious beliefs into their daily life. A pious person is very careful not to claim to know the will of the gods or to claim the divine ability to peer deeply into the hearts and souls of others. Such a person will never use his religious convictions to judge others publicly or privately. He would never smear another's reputation, and he would certainly never have anyone imprisoned or put to death because he claims to have divine knowledge about him, which is not accessible to human beings. He would never support people who make public pronouncements of their piety or who judge and condemn others. He would not use religious beliefs to gain power over others in any way, personal or political. This is, Socrates believes in or accepts the power of nous, divine nous, but that certainly has no implications for understanding or condemning other people. A pious person would recognize that the only legitimate claim to authority or any kind of wisdom, and the most important and visible characteristic of a wise person is his piety, that is, his recognition of the extreme limitations on human power and human knowledge. Such a pious person would not have a blind belief in a literal interpretation of any holy books, including the holy books of his nation and age, because he would recognize that all human recordings of the nature of the divine are interpretations and subject to human fallibility. For this very reason, a pious person would have a personal commitment to engage in continual examination and re-examination of his own religious beliefs and practices and those of his society. Such a person would recognize the social need for religious leaders who are truly pious and who can understand and apply the nature of divinity to the daily lives and social events of the people around him. A pious person would recognize the difference between authentic and inauthentic religious leadership. Socrates seems to fit that pattern. Piety, in my view, also concerns the relation between the generations and finding a balance between tradition and change. Traditional notions of filial piety demand that children respect their parents and that the younger generation respects its elders. Natural and filial piety assumes that wisdom comes with age. It demands that citizens respect laws and institutions of the society. What happens, however, if children believe their parents are impious? What if they believe their parents have broken the laws or have created unjust laws? This is certainly a potentially tragic situation. Any child in such a situation should feel torn between conflicting obligations. The child cannot choose both, but must violate an ethical demand he or she believes in deeply. Certainly Euthyphro's situation, if described in this way, could be construed as tragic. But Socrates' discussion with Euthyphro makes it clear that Euthyphro's situation is not tragic because Euthyphro does not feel torn. He thinks his own assessment of the situation is absolutely right. What about cases in which a child uses such a situation to gain a reputation for himself in a court of law? Wouldn't this be the most impious action of all, to use one's relationship to one's parents for political purposes in the name of respect for tradition, to condemn one's own parents? This seems to be true of Euthyphro. What about cases where a younger man believes an older citizen, not his father or relation, is guilty of impiety and of corrupting the youth? Should he respect his elders and ignore the situation, thereby violating his duty to protect others and the social order? Or should he prosecute and violate notions of respect for elders for the sake of justice and preserving social order? This also could be a truly tragic conflict. But from what we read in the Apology, it seems clear that Mellitus is not motivated by a love of truth or by piety. Rather, Mellitus uses traditional notions of natural piety to condemn a man he knows is not a traditional believer, and thereby gain a public reputation for being a pious man. Such abuse of one's elders and of the political system for one's personal gain is extremely impious. How can the public recognize the difference between authentic piety and the false appearance of piety? As I said at the beginning of this paper, one main purpose of the Euthyphro dialogue is to present models of true piety and false piety, so the reader can reflect and gain a better understanding of piety and be able to recognize a pious person and an impious person in their everyday lives. Certainly Socrates represents the truly pious human being in Plato's view. Socrates engages in continual self-examination and the examination of others concerning the meaning and application of the holy books and the relationship between the human and divine. He asks others to examine themselves. Socrates' ability to distinguish between what he knows and does not know does not, unfortunately, make him immune to tragedy. Rather, Socrates' situation in life is truly tragic. Of the three characters in the dialogue, only Socrates' situation is authentically tragic. Socrates' tragic conflict, not only as described here but throughout the Platonic dialogues, is that he had to get up every morning and decide if he was going to disobey his divine calling and stay home, or else follow his calling and end up being condemned and even possibly killed by the Athenians because he knew they were incapable of distinguishing between the piety of Euthyphro and the sophists and his own authentic pursuit of wisdom. It is Socrates who is caught in a dilemma because either choice will lead to disaster. He never hesitates about which choice to make, however. Can we say then, as Nussbaum says, that Plato and or Socrates' goal in life is to find a way of life which will eliminate tragic conflict? Hardly. Certainly Plato assumed that every well-educated graduate of his academy, every student who had assimilated the model of Socrates as a pattern for his own life, would be confronted with a life filled with real tragic conflict, the same kind of conflict Socrates faced every day. The Euthyphro dialogue is an effort to avoid unnecessary, apparently tragic situations like Euthyphro's and Mellitus' cases. But these situations are not authentically tragic, because Mellitus and Euthyphro are not acting from virtuous motives. I claimed at the beginning of this paper that the purpose of the Euthyphro was to establish two patterns or paradigms, one of the perfectly pious man and the other of the perfectly impious one. Now that the patterns have been identified, does this mean the ability to recognize such patterns in one's own life and in the lives of others will make it possible to recognize exactly which actions are pious and which impious, and to resolve all conflicts about religious belief and practice? Nussbaum's claim that the goal of philosophy is to make human life intelligible so that no tragic conflicts or intellectual disputes can occur. But I don't think this was Plato's goal. I mean, it's crazy to think that. Recognizing patterns of soul can help us live well and live more examined lives. Since piety is a property of agents rather than of actions, a pious person might indeed make a mistake and commit an impious act. But over the long run, pious people act piously, and impious people act impiously. Nussbaum further claims that Plato's system of education tries to lead people from being attached to other people, and hence vulnerable, to being attached to ideas, and therefore as invulnerable as humanly possible. Does this reading of the Euthyphro support that view? No. Socrates is portrayed here as very vulnerable. He even chooses to be vulnerable by leaving home every morning to converse with the Athenians. Is Plato's system of education aimed at teaching people to fall in love with institutions and ideas rather than with particular individuals? Again, the answer is no. The highest level of thought, noesis, is the intellectual perception of how ideas are embedded in the paradigms and patterns of people's lives. Plato's not seeking a perfectly detached, perfectly systematic body of ideas which will explain the human condition without having to live in the midst of the trials and tribulations of human life. Rather, the dialogue shows how a desire for a perfectly consistent body of democratic laws can lead to judgments which are extremely impious. Nussbaum's interpretation of the dialogue, then, seems to leave out many of Plato's most important points. Saxenhaus, on the other hand, agrees that one message of the dialogue is that Euthyphro, not Socrates, is trying to fit human beings into a supposedly universal, supposedly rational system of law. Saxenhaus is correct to claim that Socrates cares deeply about each Athenian. He cares about their souls, and he cares about their confusion. He cares about their legitimate desire to preserve social stability and to demand respect for elders and for the laws. He cares about their desire to condemn those who would threaten their legitimate needs and their need to have leaders who truly care about piety and justice. Unfortunately and tragically, the Athenians mistook the man who had the most to offer them for the man who was threatening them. The situation was deeply and truly tragic.